National Organization on Disability presents Employment Tracker Data, New Standards for Disability Workforce Inclusion, Thursday, February 3rd, 2022.
Welcome to today's National Organization on Disability webinar, our first of 2022. My name is Felicia Nermson, and I am the Managing Director of Employer Services for NOD. My preferred pronouns are she, her. I am a white woman with dark blonde hair. I wear black rimmed glasses, and today I have on a black shirt and I'm wearing a blue jacket. I also do self-identify as a person with a disability. I have a hearing impairment and I use hearing aids, as well as I do have mental health disabilities. So today, we'll be exploring findings and trends derived from over 225 companies that participated in our employment tracker last year. And we'll dig into new analysis by Talmetrics, which for the first time ever we are able to link practices, best business practices to talent outcomes. We do have a lot of valuable information and data to cover, but first, I have just a few important details to go over and share before we continue. So if you would like to view closed captions for this event and you're not already seeing them appear on screen, please click the live transcript CC button on your toolbar located at the bottom of the Zoom window. Then select Show Subtitle. If you would like to submit a question, please click the Q&A button on your toolbar, enter your question into the box, then click Send, and I will be answering those questions or bringing those questions to our presenters today. You may also simply go ahead and enter in the chat as well. And please use the chat if you are having any logistical issues. We do have NOD staff on hand to help you as needed. There will be a Zoom poll during the event as well, and we will announce when it appears on screen. However, if you have any difficulties with the poll, please let us know in the chat box as well, and we will provide an alternative format for you. So I believe that's all of the housekeeping that I have. And now it is my pleasure to introduce you to Carol Glazer, President of the National Organization on Disability, and Chris Powell, CEO of Talmetrics. Carol?
Thank you, Felicia. I'm Carol Glazer, and I am today wearing the NOD blue that Felicia is wearing as well. I have glasses on, and it's a pleasure to be with all of you. I identify as both a mother of a child with disabilities and also as a person with a post-traumatic stress disorder. Before we get started on the content today, we do have a lot of ground to cover. I really wanted to thank members of our Corporate Leadership Council. You are the ones who make it possible for us to have this tracker survey now, and it's going into our 10th year. It's a free, confidential survey, and it's membership dues and grants from companies that make it possible for us to offer this for free, as well as the innovation agenda that we're able to engage in. I want to also thank our partners, one of our most committed partner, Diversity, Inc., not only for making disability a vital part of the diversity conversation, but for making the tracker a requirement for companies who want to be considered to be on Diversity, Inc.'s top 50 list of companies for diversity. Very pleased to be joined by my partner, my co-presenter, Chris Powell, CEO of Talmetrics. I'll let Chris introduce himself, and then I'll come back and talk about the tracker.
Thank you, Carol. And again, glad to be here with you today. I'm Chris Powell, CEO of Talmetrics. I am an African-American male with a beard and goatee. I am wearing a heather gray turtleneck today, and I have glasses on as well. So super excited to join Carol and the NOD team today and sharing some really insightful insights about what we learned from the tracker. Carol?
So our goal this year for the tracker was a couple of things. Every year we refresh the survey design because we want to stay on top of evolving trends. We want to discard, in some cases, practices that are just becoming table stakes, where nearly 100% of all survey respondents are engaging in those practices. And we want to stay ahead of the curve when it comes to new trends. And you'll see some of that reflected in questions on digital accessibility and on mental health. But this year, especially, is something of a revolution with the tracker in partnership with Talmetrics, and that is being able to correlate practices with disability inclusion outcomes. We know that self-ID is important, but we know a lot of other metrics are important as well, whether it's recruitment, retention, promotion of high potential candidates, and other metrics. And we wanted to see what practices correlate most highly with those HR outcomes. And we'll be reviewing those with you today for the balance of the webinar. But also we use this data to inform our own research, our own thought leadership agenda, because fundamentally we're about attitude change and about seeing familiar concepts in some new ways. And so if you go on to the next slide, what we want to do today with you, we're going to cover a lot of ground. We're going to do it quickly and leave room for questions. But really our top learning objective is what I just mentioned. The fact that companies have been asking us, if I want to improve my self-ID rate, which is most commonly measured, as we'll see, but I want to achieve other metrics, how do I know what practices are going to be most efficient and most effective to getting there? We also want to learn how corporate America is progressing along a disability employment maturity curve, which goes from compliance at the bottom level all the way to competitive advantage, where there are more and more companies that are seeing disability inclusion as a competitive advantage. They're becoming employers of choice, which is of growing importance in today's great resignation and so many changes happening on the front of disability workforce inclusion. Finally, we'll take a little bit of a look into the 22 employment tracker, which is out now. You can register for it until March 11th, and we'll talk more about that as we go along. Next slide. So we at NOD see our work really in terms of a three-legged stool, and it starts with data. And it starts with data from the tracker. But we collect other data as well from our innovation programs. Some of you know about Wounded Warrior Careers, Bridges to a Better Workforce, Campus to Careers. We were recently awarded a federal grant to engage in some experimental design type research on what practices work. And so we use that data to inform our articulation of what works, and to communicate that. Again, communication is such an important part of the work, whether it's in the form of social media, earned media, blogs, white papers, presentations at company town halls. We're basically trying to change people's view of disability from being an illness or being a deficit that needs charity to being a talent that needs opportunity. And communicating that and changing the way we view disability is a fundamental part of who we are at NOD. And then finally, once we know what works and we've communicated it out to the world of employers, we also want to advocate for public policies in Washington that are based on the things we know that work. Next slide, please. So we're going to go through now more about the tracker and how we are able to link practices to outcomes, as I mentioned. If you go into the next slide, the employment tracker gives you a very quick way of assessing your workforce inclusion, disability workforce inclusion practices against all the others in the pool. And as Felicia noted, we have this year 225 companies actually filled out the survey. based on their performance in the year 2020, most of calendar year 2020. It's free, it's confidential. And after you complete the survey, you get from NOD a benchmarking scorecard that shows you how your performance ranks in relation to others in the pool. You'll see where your performance is, where the whole pool is. And then this year, for the first time, we also show you how the top quartile of companies scoring compares with your own performance as well. So that when you want to get to that point of becoming a leader in a particular area, you can see how the top quartile companies are performing. You can also re-enroll in the tracker year over year. And so you can measure your own trends and see how you're progressing, again, along the employment maturity curve. It's typically completed by HR or D&I leaders. And again, it takes about 2 hours to complete. It's a very efficient survey. Next slide, please. This year, we separated out performance into 6 areas. And in particular, we separated out talent outcome metrics from strategy. We found that those 2 things are very significant parts of what companies are doing and what they need to do in order to be successful. And so we have a whole separate category on talent outcome metrics, and that's what enables us to correlate other practices with these important HR metrics. And Chris is going to give you quite a bit more detail on which practices are so highly linked to those talent outcomes. If you look at the next slide, oh, there you are. Thank you, Felicia. You can see the actual talent outcomes that we know companies care most about. These are the ones that we looked at, and these are the ones that Chris is going to be describing to you in just a few minutes. If you go to the next slide, you can see that what a company will get after completing the survey, after the results are tallied by Talmetrics, you get a sense of your own performance in various areas, in all the 6 areas that we just outlined, your own performance, how that compares with all companies subscribing to the tracker, and then how that compares with companies in the top quartile. The top quartile companies are the ones that receive NOD's Leading Disability Employer seal. And we award that every year. By definition, it's only 25% of the companies who fill out the tracker survey. It's a pretty competitive award. We're proud of it, and we're very excited about being able to announce the winners this year at our annual forum for our Leadership Council, which also is a celebration of NOD's 40th anniversary. Next slide. I'm going to share this with you at the end of our time together today. But just to remind you, you can still submit, you can register, you can go to our website and you'll get a link and you'll be able to complete the survey, and it goes until March 11th. So this is a good window now. Before we jump into the results, I wanted to just do a very quick poll, and Felicia's going to help with tallying the results. How many people have completed the tracker? And you're going to answer that with a yes/no question. And we're going to be able to read back the results to you in real time. How are we doing?
We're doing well. Dustin, are you able to share those results?
66% of folks have not completed the tracker before.
Wow.
30-some-odd% have. Fantastic. We're going to get the other 60% of you by the end of this session. I just know it. So Chris, over to you for key insights from the 2021 tracker.
Carol, thank you. Thank you for the handoff. And this is really interesting that we've got 66% of you never having taken the tracker before, because it's my job to show you some of the value of the insights and data that can be used to help you advance your disability strategy within your organization. So to get us started, a couple of things I'll share you. This past year, we had 228 companies participate and from across many different industries in this year's 2021 tracker. 21% of those organizations were represented by financial services, 20% in healthcare, consumer space 16, industrial manufacturing 14%, information technology 10%, and other broad industry categories represented 19%. So we have a very diverse group of organizations completing the tracker each year, and so it really gives us a really insight. Our goal is to double the number of companies completing the tracker. And over the next 3 years, in order to continue to increase the data available to understand the progress being made in terms of practices and outcomes companies are achieving. We also are we actually are creating programs and learning opportunities to address the gaps. As you heard Felicia mention, employer services works with organizations to identify those gaps and recognize those organizations who are leading the way for disability inclusion in the workplace. Next slide, please. So now I'm going to share with you some of those practices most highly correlated to increasing self-ID rates. Carol teed this up really nicely that we know that there are some, this year with the tracker, we learned by separating out talent outcomes from the other categories, we were able to start to isolate which of those practices that we measure and track in the tracker actually have the highest influence on self-ID rates. So here on this slide, we're looking at how companies measure progress. As most of you know, if not all, most companies track self-ID rates as the primary talent outcome to measure employees with disabilities in their workplace. However, only 76% of all companies completing the 2021 tracker were tracking self-ID. And it is much less when we look at other talent outcome metrics specific to employees with disabilities at 48%. Now, compared to 86% of companies that are tracking those same metrics for their other traditional D&I dimensions of diversity or populations within their organization. So you can see there's a lot more opportunity for organizations to advance the data that they're capturing on people with disabilities in their organization beyond self-ID included and beyond some key metrics that give some insight for this population. Next slide, please. Here is what we found. Companies tracking more talent outcome metrics had a self-ID rate significantly higher than those companies only tracking self-ID. So those who were doing self-ID plus had a higher self-ID rate overall. On average, 1.116% versus 4.69% for those organizations. So those organizations only tracking self-ID rate had a 1.6% self-ID rate versus those organizations who were tracking self-ID plus other metrics had a 4.69% self-ID rate. So you can see the marked difference that tracking more metrics related to people with disabilities has a correlation in this data set to showing a higher self-ID rate overall. Next slide, please. So Carol mentioned earlier top practices around correlating to self-ID. And as we discussed, new this year and first in the field that we're able to correlate the three categories of strategy, talent sourcing, and people practices have the greatest impact on positively driving self-ID rates within organizations. Again, this happened with us doing a different set of analysis and identifying those outcomes versus all of the other program processes and policies that organizations do in support of people with disability. The best practices listed below on this slide are the categories and the practices driving self-ID rates. And companies implementing these practices had significantly higher self-ID rate. I won't run through them all on this slide, but I think you will hear and know, and some are self-evident. However, you will also consider that 76% of companies are tracking self-ID, and we know companies are at various different stages of that maturity model that Carol and Felicia mentioned earlier. So when we look at practices that are highly correlated to driving self-ID rate, the three categories again are strategy, talent sourcing, and people practices. And one key practice supporting strategy is that organizations are tracking the ratio of applicants with disabilities to all job applicants. And this gives a sense of what I call the fairness equity ratio in terms of your strategy. Are you achieving that vis-a-vis your strategy as one of those variables? Talent sourcing. One of the practices we identified is that recruiters are trained to find and administer the company's accommodation process, not just waiting for that to happen post-hire, but the recruiters are also able to articulate and communicate that to applicants who may have a disability in order to help drive higher closure rates on job applicants. Another one of those practices supporting the people practices that we saw, a lot of practices today, is that organizations take action to retain employees who age into disability. And this is really interesting as we think about the Great Resignation and what we also call the Great Reshuffle. Keep it in mind that your talent and retention strategies also need to consider individuals aging into disability. So that gives you an initial frame of some of those key practices that we correlated to driving higher self-ID rates. We also ran additional analysis and identified the 12 to 15 practices that are most highly related and shared with those of members of the NOD Leadership Council in an extended scorecard, so where there's much more detail of those additional practices that are driving higher self-ID rates. All right. Next slide, please. One of the things we look at in terms of when you think about all of the factors that drive employee experience, engagement, retention, and development is looking at things vis-a-vis the employment life cycle. So from job applicant to development to engagement and so on and so forth into that cycle. And so what we're going to focus on here on this slide is looking at connecting those connecting practices with self-ID rates, where we're able to make the connection for a business practice influencing a particular talent outcome that's related to the employee life cycle. In this slide, we're going to talk about job applicants. Here are the practices most highly correlated to better outcomes with job applicants. Again, some may seem obvious. However, we know through our research and data that companies continue to struggle with making their job applicant systems more compliant and accessible. We should also point out that more focus is on how companies are investing their philanthropic dollars, and only 1.3% of the total spend is allocated to a disability. And many may say, why does philanthropic contributions matter? We know for a significant portion of the workforce, a company's corporate social responsibility and where they are supporting social enterprise and community matters as a driver and an attractor to attract talent to an organization. So there are some things that also keep in mind in the broader of where your organization's corporate social responsibility strategy ties in to helping drive higher applicants with people with disabilities. Also, we also noted that there's a huge disparity And we hope with the additional focus on disability and philanthropy with funders like the Hilton Family Foundation recently making a significant contribution to support disability, that this will continue to raise the awareness of the alignment between your corporate social responsibility strategy with your talent strategy, specifically for people with disabilities. Next slide, please. As we continue to move through the employment life cycle of moving from that entry point of being a job applicant to a new hire, we're going to look at a few of the disability practices that we saw that were correlating to the talent outcome of representation of people with disabilities in new hire populations. In order to create a plan to include disability in your diversity strategy, we see the importance of accessibility with your systems and making materials available in accessible formats, having disability champions and working with partners to increase the likelihood that you can convert those job applicants of folks with disabilities into new hires. So as they always say, it takes a community, that what you do inside the organization to help drive that conversion, as well as how you leverage your partners in this process, as well as your technology to do so. Okay. Next, as we continue to move through that life cycle from job applicant to new hire, now we're going to talk about promotions, which is really part of those aspects of career development and career experience to drive retention and engagement in the organization. And so as we think about and look at some of the key practices that came out through the analysis, we can also understand tracking percentage of employees by job group and by manager has an impact regardless of whether you are a federal contractor or not. We do know from the current employee surveys that a key driver of engagement for people with disabilities are their relationships with their immediate manager. And so that relationship with that immediate manager who is coaching, supporting, and advocating for their career development is really important, and also enables individuals with disabilities to be promotable and ready for promotions when those opportunities come forward. So again, promotions is really focused on engagement and development as part of that, helping companies achieve higher self-ID rates. Next slide, please. And as we move through the cycle again, now we're looking at some of those core practices that were identified that are directly associated with driving employee retention outcomes. And we know, again, back to the Great Resignation and the Great Reshuffle, individuals were looking for those things that, hey, can I achieve my career growth and career aspirations at this organization? Is this a psychological safe environment for me to be? Do I have the agency and the assets in order to thrive in this environment? And so when we look at this data, and retaining employees with disabilities not only administer employee engagement surveys, they also analyze that data, that engagement survey data by disability as a diversity category to identify what's unique to this population in the organization, as opposed to some organizations don't go to that level of detail, so therefore can't inform their strategy as specifically on what they can do to drive engagement and retention in the organization for people with disabilities. The first practice here goes directly to representation. Seeing ourselves is a first indication of commitment, and companies continue to demonstrate that commitment through education and ensuring managers are empowered to understand the interactive process and administering the accommodation policy are all key factors to helping drive retention inside of our organization. Next slide, please. And so as we look, and I'm gonna, we also look specifically at the NOD Leadership Council member performance. And what we found here, members of the NOD's Leadership Council are routinely outperforming non-council members. Results from the NOD's benchmarking assessment, the 2020 tracker, also show that council members routinely score higher marks in all 6 inclusion categories, including climate and culture, talent sourcing, people practices, workplace and technology, and veterans employment. In addition, council members are showing that they have improved self-ID rates by 21% since 2018, as compared to non-council members who showed an increase of just below 1% at 0.26% in the same period. So you can see here, there's a significant difference of those organizations that are a member of the Leadership Council and their self-ID rates versus those non-council members. So overall, members of the NOD's Corporate Leadership Council have a 6% higher self-ID rates than their peers who are non-members. So as they say, membership matters here. All right. And so now, as we go to the next slide, where are we now? And so members of the NOD, I'm sorry, wrong slide. There is still much work to be done in terms of climate and culture, program, policy practice standpoint with people with disabilities. As I mentioned, 79% of the companies are tracking new hires, and they're averaging 27% of their hiring of people with disabilities. So that they're seeing that 27% of the people that they're hiring have disabilities. So that's a significant number there. 59% of those companies are tracking turnover. And so back to the employment life cycle, we are tracking, more companies are tracking on the front end of the process, and fewer companies are tracking in on the back end of the process of things and factors around, metrics around turnover. Again, the Great Resignation, if we were looking to retain more of our workers and including people with disabilities, we need to start understanding what's the push-pull factors inside of an organization. All right, next slide here. And so as we get ready to move forward, Carol's going to share with you where we've made progress and where we've lost progress over time. Carol, back to you.
Thanks, Chris. Yes, there's good news and bad news. Some people like the bad news first, so let's go there. We were able to track year-over-year progress since 2019. Remembering that this was the first full year of the pandemic, it's an important backdrop for looking at these numbers. Because on the other side, you see that many of the practices that Chris just outlined for you as bearing a lot of weight with respect to HR outcomes, that companies are reducing their practices in those areas. So when you look at that, at the recruitment phase, you see that where recruiter education matters, that has decreased by 24%. Campus disability recruiting decreased 31%. Targeted experience disability decreased 19%. And you can see again through the life cycle, the compliance with 503 and some of the other aspects of disability inclusion that end up mattering, also reductions. And then finally on the retention side, which we know management training and education is important to retaining, to retention, we saw that decrease. Our theory on this is that we really should look at the second whole year of the pandemic, because if you think of 2020 again, as the kind of deer in the headlights year for corporate America, where we were just adjusting to this pandemic, and a lot of the forward-looking initiatives we may have had in all of diversity and inclusion, but especially in disability, which is a newer field, it's plausible the pandemic had something to do with it. But happily, if you go on to the next slide, on the next two slides, you can see that there's some real, very significant progress since 2019. When you look at companies who are taking action to retain employees who age into disability, we know that almost 85% of all disability is acquired, often through illness or injury. And so that group of employees who are aging into disability while they're still in the workforce is very important. And it's very good to see almost a 50% increase in that number. What that signals is not only an employer who cares about its employees, but also an employer who cares about keeping knowledge and that base of wisdom that older employees often possess to harness that and keep it on board. If you look at companies using job boards, there again, we are seeing that it's almost a doubling of companies using job boards to hire candidates with disabilities. And we also know that those job boards help to increase the level of recruitment. So there's a practice that we know has results and we know has doubled between 2019 and this last year, 2021. Next slide looks at digital accessibility. And we know that that's on everybody's agenda who is thinking about disability workforce inclusion. And here too, we were happy to see almost a 20% increase from 77 to 95% of companies who are compliant with Section 508 of the Rehab Code. Compliance is a good place to start. We suggest that companies not end with mere compliance, but that's a good place to start with digital accessibility. And when you look also at web content accessibility guidelines, which is really kind of a checklist of important practices for websites to be compliant, you also see an increase from 61 to 89%. That's almost a 30% increase since 2019. Very happy to see those results. The next slide, we try to summarize really. What did we learn? What does all this amount to for us? And I would summarize it in the following way. There's no easy answer. There's no silver bullet. There are no 1, 2, or 3 things that are going to lead to better HR metrics. You've got to invest the work. Very interesting data point that we see here on the slide of the third bullet, which talks about self-ID campaigns, which many companies are mounting at some expense. It's an important and a common enough practice. We wanted to understand whether that was correlated with higher rates of self-ID. And indeed, when you isolate that one factor of a self-ID campaign, you see that it does not result in statistically higher rates of self-ID. Now, that doesn't mean self-ID campaigns aren't working. It means you have to do them in conjunction with a whole lot of other things, because if you don't, your employees are not going to trust you. They're going to wonder why you're asking these questions, and it could backfire. So we really recommend to companies that are coming to us ready to mount self-ID campaigns, don't make that be your major or your only source of investment. You've got to do the work on all the other practices that Chris mentioned as being important. And that's really what these bullets tell us. And we hope that we're going to be able to see continued good progress as we move along next year. If you go to the next slide, just for a very brief look at what's new in 2022. The next slide tells you that we are really not significantly changing the survey in 22. That's the survey that's now open, but rather we're putting an increased focus on questions around mental health. We know that we've seen a spike in mental health issues. We know that's on everybody's mind right now, that COVID has created an increase in anxiety rates and depression rates and mental illness generally throughout the workforce. More and more companies are asking, how do we deal with that? What do we do about it? What does our EAP do? What do managers do? So we have some more questions there. And we also have even more questions on digital accessibility. It is an issue of increasing concern and increasing investment for much of corporate America. You go to the next slide and you see some examples. In particular, on this slide, here are some questions that you'll find in the survey related to Mental health, we know that senior leaders promoting mental health initiatives are likely to be a very important factor in increasing comfort levels and increasing people's ability to deal with the stresses and strains of mental illness that has spiked so heavily now. Having somebody on the staff who's responsible, some companies call it an ambassador. We want to see how many companies are actually doing that, because obviously when someone's in charge of it, the company's going to be paying attention to it. And again, you see training here, and training really shows up over and over again in so many aspects of disability workforce inclusion. And then finally, on digital accessibility, you can see some sample questions there. We want to know how companies are dealing with their vendors. Are they requiring their vendors and their other partners to be WCAG compliant or to be Section 508 compliant? That's a way of holding people accountable. And because so many companies depend on third-party managers and vendors for their digital accessibility, it ends up being very important. And then, of course, do you have a strategy? We are getting increasing requests from companies to have a digital accessibility strategy. We say they're the same thing. There isn't one strategy, there isn't one practice that works. There's really a whole range of them. If you go to the next slide, the last thing that I would point out is that in addition to taking the tracker, getting a scorecard, being part of NOD's Leadership Council, we're also available and on hand to help companies take a deeper dive into your tracker results. And we call this a disability inclusion executive briefing. And we will ask you to pick 3 areas of your tracker results, of those 6 areas that we outlined at the beginning, and we will give you access to our in-house consultants on disability inclusion. We will make recommendations for you for short and medium and long-term results, and we will make presentations to your senior leaders where you want to get better buy-in, or you want to just make sure that your leadership is better informed about what you're doing. It's a very good way of taking the tracker and the efficient process of filling out the survey and really turning it into a robust strategy that's going to get results. Final slide. Once again, you can enroll in the tracker now. The deadline is March 11th. Again, it was designed to be very efficient for very busy executives, and be sure to submit. You have to go online. You can see the website address to go to. And if you do have any problems, you can see at the bottom of the screen, please email us at tracker@nod.org with any questions that you have about registering. And that completes our presentation for today. I hope we have some questions and maybe some comments, requests. I think we have a little bit of time.
We do have some questions, Carol. So I think a lot of them were really around whether or not the presentation is going to be available after. And we are going to make the recording available to everyone that is attending today, which is a little bit different. We normally only make it available to our Leadership Council members. But since so many of you that are attending today are not members, we would like for you to have this information so that you can complete the tracker. We would love to invite you to complete the tracker and let us know if you have any questions. So that is something we're doing special today for our everyone who's attending. We do have someone's asking if the executive briefing is available to all companies who participate. The answer is yes. Go ahead, Carol.
Nope, that was.
Then someone is asking just about their last year's results. So we will certainly follow up with you about your results just to find out what company you're from, and we'll go ahead and get those over to you if the tracker was completed. Someone's saying thank you for making it recording available. Okay, here's another one. Is the tracker suitable for nonprofit and philanthropic organizations? or is it really only appropriate for corporations?
Well, Carol, you want to take that?
Oh.
I'm
Oh,
happy.
no, I was waiting for Felicia. Of course, it's available. We have many nonprofits who take this survey, and they learn as much as for-profit companies do.
Thank you. And then, have companies used the tracker to meet federal contractor requirements? A good one. The answer is yes on that one, right? It really is a matter of, again, understanding where you are with your disability inclusion practice internally with your workplace and workforce. And we're asking really a lot of those questions that would be part of a focused review for you, as well as far as the guidelines are concerned under the Section 503 changes. So a lot of those questions are being asked, as well as we certainly would be happy to take a deeper dive. If you complete the tracker, you have some additional questions, we would be happy to consult with you on that.
Yeah.
You know, the beauty of the tracker, besides the fact that it's free, is that it really is a compilation of best practices. Every question on the survey has the correct answer is yes. And that's how we derive all the data we've been able to repeat back for you today. But in and of itself, the survey really gives you a lot of information about how to mount a good disability workforce inclusion strategy. So we encourage companies to take it, whether or not they go any further with it.
Yeah. And Carol and Felicia, if you also don't mind me adding this point too, we also are seeing many of the corporate leadership councils use the data and the insights from the tracker to inform their ESG communication and rollout, or their CSR strategy, as well as their overall talent strategy. So we're seeing quite a bit of value that companies are getting from using the tracker report and the best practices that Felicia and Carol mentioned to you as well.
Who might I speak with about self-identification by people with disabilities? We'll put, if one of my team members could put some email addresses in the chat box for people who have asked questions around who we should contact, et cetera, that would be fantastic if we could just put some the email addresses in the chat box, please. As well as, let's see, in the beginning of the presentation, you showed a slide with different industries that participated, and I saw the financial industries. Does this category include the insurance industry, or would that be a separate category?
They're together, aren't they, Chris?
Yeah, I got it. No, happy to take it. So financial services is broad financial service. So it includes insurance, banking, credit unions in that vein. So it's broad financial services.
Somebody asked the question, is the tracker appropriate for very small companies? And the truth is that it does take a certain critical mass to mount a more aggressive disability inclusion strategy. But we've seen a lot of small businesses who are small enough that they really can make a difference, particularly those who consider themselves part of their community and those who want to make investments in their workers. So disability workforce inclusion is for everyone, but the kinds of practices that we've profiled here really are more typical of companies with 50 or more employees.
Here's another one, Carol, just around, if my leadership team is concerned, we may score low and therefore may not participate, right? So is the tracker useful for beginners?
It absolutely is. It was originally designed for beginners. We're pleased that those who are progressing along the maturity curve still find it helpful, but it is a wonderful place to start. It's confidential. Your results are shared with nobody. You don't even have to opt in if you would prefer not to for consideration for our Leading Disability Employer Award. But by all means, take the tracker and you can keep the results limited to whomever in your company wants to see them, or just for yourself.
Thank you. Then we have, let's see, do school districts often participate in the survey? And we don't really have school districts that would participate as much as we will have maybe a university, college, the higher ed. would participate in the survey, and we have had them in the past. However, we have not had school districts participate.
We keep getting questions about whether we'll make this presentation available, and I will tell you that over the course of this Zoom cast, we have made an instant change in our policy, and we will be sharing it with everybody who's on today. If you're interested enough to join us and to ask such good questions, we certainly feel like it's important enough to share the results with you. So we will make the recording available.
Who is the best person? Thank you for that, Carol, very much. I think that, again, we continue to see that. So thank you for that clarification. Who is the best person to be responsible to fill out the tracker, or should it be a group project?
It's usually a group project, but there is usually one leader who takes responsibility for gathering the data from other departments.
And we also will make the tracker for that purpose. We make the tracker available to you either in Word or I think Excel this year as well, so that you can break it up and then send it out to the appropriate team members to complete the sections. So happy to do that. You just need to get in touch with the info box on the tracker. I did put the slide up. People were asking what the deadline date is again. So I went back to the slide that has the information to complete the tracker. So that's all set. And then for the deep dive mentioned earlier, is there a cost associated with that? Yes, that would be part of or one of the services that we offer. However, when you are a member of the Leadership Council, you do have the opportunity for us to walk you through the tracker scorecard with those additional insights, as well as you do have some free consulting time available to you. While we may not have all of the information that's available as far as the deep dive is concerned, it certainly is time very well spent in being able to take your consulting time and look at those tracker results together and bring other members of your team and your leadership team together to go through those results as well. All right. Do you have any research or guidelines available to help companies move towards a centralized accommodation process and centralized budget? We do have some information available for that. It is on our Leadership Council members only portal. So if you would like access to that information, again, if you could just get in touch with us. If you are a Leadership Council member, please reach out to your relationship manager, as well as I would really like to see if we could put some information in the chat box around with the appropriate email address for someone to get in contact with. So if one of my NOD team members could please do that, I would greatly appreciate it. If you are unsure of a question that you think may be a yes, but has a 15% chance as a no, should you mark the question as do not know, unsure? I'm going to give that one to you, Chris.
And again, from a benchmarking standpoint, if you're not sure, check the not sure in this case, because what we want to do is make sure that there's integrity to the data when we're doing the comparisons. However, the not sure, if it's more like the 80 for the 20, then go with the number. But if you're less than 80% sure on that number, because again, that's the number that we're using to power the comparison with other organizations. So definitely the more definitive you can be, the better in driving the comparisons in the data.
Thank you for that, Chris, very much. We have a couple of questions around if there's a fee for consulting services after completing the tracker. And I think I just answered that, but yes, if you are not a Leadership Council member, there is if you're not a leadership council member, sorry, there is a fee for us to go through your tracker results with you, as well as there's a fee for that executive briefing. There's no free consulting. If you do become a member of the leadership council, as I said, you have a lot of different benefits available to you. And what is the fee for the leadership council? Oh, hold on, I'm sorry, I'm getting another. There are 2 tiers for the Leadership Council right now, and we will be happy to go ahead and put that in the chat box as well. This year, it is right now $25,000 and $30,000 for the 2 tiers. And then in 2023, we will be going to a different pricing structure. So something to look forward to. Did I answer that correctly, Carol? I want to make sure. Confirming.
Definitely, Felicia.
Thank you.
And Priyanka has put into the chat box where to go for more information on the Leadership Council. And also, while I have the floor, Terry, thank you for this message, but we are sending out a post-webinar survey tomorrow, and we hope that you will let us know how we did today. But it's also another place where you can ask us more questions and we will respond.
And here is one more question that we do have. I think we have time for a couple more questions if we want to go ahead. And if you have any other questions, please feel free to share those with us. But is the tracker going to help us get better at disability inclusion? How have other companies used their tracker results to progress? This is such a great question. And this year, we really have provided some great examples, both on our website and as part of our social media around those companies that have really used the tracker to progress and really move on from compliance into, and up the maturity curve, if you will. So the short answer is yes, it absolutely does help you get better at disability inclusion. And we do have some examples of companies that have used the tracker very effectively to really help not only as far as practices are concerned, it's not about practices as much as it is about understanding where are your strengths, where are your gaps, and then using that information to really put together your strategy overall. And how does that fit with your overall disability and inclusion strategy? So absolutely, we would be happy to have that conversation with you directly about how you can use the tracker, as well as if you have any questions when you're filling it out, we are available to help you with that. Would you add anything, Chris or Carol?
Yeah, I mean, from the data that we've analyzed over the years, looking back over 3-year trends in the data, we do see companies making progress who've used the tracker and the briefing sessions as a way to, as Felicia just outlined, learn, hey, what you're doing, where you've got opportunities to do more. And what we've seen just in today and sharing some of the data points, those companies that are tracking more metrics around people with disability have a higher self-ID rate, which means they're looking more holistically end to end from the beginning of the life cycle, from job applicants all the way through, so that they can learn more of what they could do to attract and retain people with disabilities. So I definitely can say empirically, looking at the data, it has and does matter.
Ben, can we share an anecdotal experience or story of getting executives that are not champions to lean in and embrace what the data means need for change? Do you have one, Carol, off the top of your head?
I was gonna, this is a cousin to the question that was asked, and that is some interesting data we heard from one of our council members. A senior leader in this company recently disclosed their own disability, and their self-ID rates went up by 50% in that one period of time. So it's not exactly turning a senior leader around as much as using a senior leader to turn others around. But when you can almost feel that collective sigh of relief when a senior leader comes forward. and discloses a disability, it makes it okay for everybody else to come forward, and it just relaxes everybody. There are a lot of stories on our Look Closer part of our website. Look Closer was a campaign that we had urging employers to look closer at this talent pool, this untapped talent pool. And we've collected now over almost 100 stories of people who have been successful, many of them managers who have been successful in their work, not in spite of, but because of often their disabilities. And that's a good way to tell the story to leaders who might be a little bit reticent. Storytelling is the best avenue for something like this consistently. Somebody asked also, is the tracker applicable to federal agencies? Absolutely, by all means. I see you answered that. Thank you, Felicia.
No, but thank you for answering it live. So we are at time. I want to thank everyone for attending today. Again, if you have any questions, I know that we have added contact information within the chat. Please feel free to reach out to any one of us. You can also find contact information on our website. I want to thank Chris Powell, our wonderful partner, for being a part of this today. Thank you, as always, Carol Glazer, our leader. And thank you to the entire team that really helped to support us for this event today. So we look forward to seeing you at future events. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye now.
For more information on NOD's employment tracker, visit www.nod.org/tracker. For more information on NOD's Leadership Council, visit www.nod.org/services/council. You can also contact us via email at events@nod.org.